I kind of just put this on. I kind of just put this on to make sure that you guys could actually see the command line in the back. Hopefully I don't get caught for like copyright infringement or anything like that showing this on a video. Right? So let's get started. So my name is Cecil Phillip, and I'm going to be talking to you guys today about security in ASP .NET Core. How many of you guys were at the previous session just now? Most of you. OK, great. So I could skip a couple of things. All right. So really quick about me. So my name is Cecil Phillip. I've been a .NET developer for about a little bit over 8 years or so. I teach, I develop. I actually have a podcast too that I'd really love for you guys to check out. Really quick plug. I'm not going to talk anymore about that. So what we're going to talk about today is how can we secure our ASP .NET Core applications. Right? We're going to look at a couple of things like claims identity. We're going to look at some of the new features like middleware and tag helpers, and also can we do security policies. Right? How many of you guys are building apps on .NET Core right now? Or played with it a little bit? Anything like that? No? So there's actually a lot of cool stuff in .NET Core, for those of you that haven't put your hands on. And we know that it's cross-platform. We know that it's open source. But some of the things that come with that means that there's a lot more things for us to think about when it comes to security. If I'm going to run on Linux, how is it different for me to secure my web server on Linux? Right? How is it different for me to secure an AWS, or if I'm running on Heroku or any of these different type of platforms? So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through really, basically be very much of an intro into security, because there's really a lot of stuff to talk about, and there's only so much we're going to cover within this next hour or so. So let's kind of start at the beginning. So when we first start talking about security in .NET, we see these two interfaces, identity and principal. Have you guys seen these before? Are these familiar? Right. So if you ever built a forms application, we know that these are pretty much what we get when we work with our users. Right? And identity represents the actual user. Right? And you can tell that this was built a while ago, because the only thing we're concerned about here is what's the name of the user, are you authenticated or not, and on the authentication type. Right? And as you can see on the right side, like there's different types of that. It could be a Windows user, it could be a generic user. If you're building in ASP.NET, like you might have seen forms identity, right? Or forms user, where my identity is stored in a cookie and it's passed back and forth. Right? Another thing we have here at the bottom is a principal. So now the principal has to do with roles, right? And it has to do more with authorization than authentication, right? So you can see it has an identity. The identity says this is who the user is. But then we also have this method is in role. What can you do? What are you allowed to do? Where am you allowed to go? Right? Now, with our ASP.NET pipeline as we're used to today, with .NET 4.5 and things before that, this is kind of what our security pipeline looks like. Right? We have modules and handlers today. When we write modules, we tap into this pipeline, into these different events that fire. Now, this is not the entire pipeline, as most of you know. The entire pipeline is maybe like 23, 24 events that actually fire off. Right? But just in terms of security, these are the ones that we're going to be concerned about. Right? So it starts at the top. We begin with our request. And then there's an authentication request event, post-authentication request, authorized request, post, and so on and so on and forth. Now, if you're like me, some of you guys might have tried to create your own identity at some point, your own custom identity, because just having a name property is probably not enough for you. You probably want a little bit more control over that. And so what you might have done is you might have written your own module and tapped into one of these events that are fired here. Right? Anybody have done that before? Anybody's tried that before? A couple of you guys? So when you write your modules, your module may look something like this. Probably with a lot more code, but it may still have a similar type of structure. Right? We define an IHTTP module. Right? That's the interface we're going to be implementing. And then we're going to create a handler based on the event that we want to tap into. So let's say I've created my custom principal and my custom identity. I might want to say, OK, after this user has already been authenticated, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to inject. I'm going to overwrite that. I'm going to put in my own principal on my own identity. Right? So now that I have, instead of having to tap into, tap into the cookie, I might have a property that says first name and last name, or I might have a property that says email, or some other things that we might want to put in there. Right? Now, moving forward, like identities become a little bit more complicated, right? You might want to be able to tap into the identity of one of your partners that you're working with. You might want to tap into the identity of For instance, like social authentication, for instance, is a big thing. I want to write an app that supports Facebook and Twitter and some of these other things. Now, the thing is, these systems might represent these properties very differently, right? The way that I represent email, the way I might represent names and things like that in one application or in one authentication system might be very different to how I support it in mine. So what we kind of came up with was this thing called claims. Is anybody familiar with claims? How claims work? Right. So claims are pretty much a statement. It's a statement of who are you and what can you do in my system. Well, more so, what can you do in my system? Right. An example of a claim is, for instance, job title and whatever the name of your job is. Right. Another thing that you get out of a claim too is not just that key value, but you also get this property called an issuer. Right. So we can say who you are. We can say who's issued this claim, the value of the claim, and the actual name of the claim. Right? So again, let's use an example. Hey, I'm going to use this app and I want to authenticate against some government database. The government's going to say, okay, hey, this is a government worker and he works for this place and it was issued by the government. Right? So now my identity now is going to have this property that's going to say, okay, I've gotten this information from this particular issue. The issuer in this case just happens to be the government, for instance. So now kind of going back to what's happening here. So what we've had now is new implementations of identity and principle, right, called claims identity and claim principle. And these are actually the default right now if you work with ASP .NET Core. Actually, if you work with .NET 4.5.1 or 2 or something like that, it's also the default if you're writing your apps on those. Right? So what you get out of this claims identity, for instance, what you notice is you have a collection of claims, and then you also too have the same properties that we've had before. When you look down here in a claims principle, what you've noticed is that instead of just having one identity, I can have multiple identities. Right? So what does that mean? If you've ever written an application that you've had to sign in with multiple accounts, maybe, then you might have multiple identities, right? And each of those separate identities are going to have its own sets of claims, right? So again, let's go back to, I'm signing into this application, and I'm signing with my Facebook account, right? And Facebook is going to give me some properties. It's going to tell me about myself, right? The groups that I'm a part of, the friends that I have, some of that type of information. And then I can sign in with Twitter, or I can sign in with just my regular username and password with cookies. And all of those might have different information about me. Still me, but the people that are issuing the information about me, they know different things about me, right? So it's one person, it's one user, but this user has multiple identities, right? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So now that we have that out of the way, so when we talk about ASP .NET Core, this thing is built on a middleware type pipeline, right? So again, if we kind of think about what we were doing today with our ASP.NET pipeline, and we have these different steps that we go through, right? We have our pipeline that we went through. Our ASP.NET Core pipeline looks a little more simpler, right? There's a lot less stuff that's kind of going on here. And so let's kind of talk about the way that this middleware stuff works, right? So when our request comes in, right, our request is going to come in at the top, it's going to come in from the server, and then we're going to have these sections of code that are going to run, right? And each one is going to run like one after the other. And then it's going to go down to our application code, right? Our application code might be where MVC is running. It might be, where SignalR is running, or anything else. But pretty much what the middleware does is it gives us a chance to inspect the request as it comes through the pipeline, right? So instead of, again, if you compare this to what we're doing today, instead of trying to tap into different events, we can kind of layer our application and decide, well, I want to run these things in this order, right? So for instance, let's give an example. Maybe you might use middleware to check for some headers, right? Maybe you want to check for a security header. Maybe I want to check and see if you're sending me my API key, right? Maybe I want to check and see if, are you even allowed to come into my website? Maybe I have a blacklist of IP addresses, right? I can check some of these things before it even gets down to my application, right? And as the developer, you choose which ones happen first, and you choose the order that they run in, right? Now, again, comparing this to what we do today, it's very much of an opt-in model versus an opt-out model, right? So I'm only getting the middleware that I want to run, right? Only the things that I put in there is what's in there, Right? Again, if we think about what happens today, regardless of whatever you're doing in your web applications, your forms module is going to run, your session module is going to run, your caching module is going to run. There's a lot of stuff that's already in the pipeline, and you may or may not want that to happen. Right? So again, so this is a very different model. Right? It's opt-in versus opt-out kind of thing. Right? Another thing that's interesting that we get in here is we also get, you're going to see this when I go through the samples, we also get the ability to have dependency injection up and down throughout the pipeline, right? So instead of your middleware, you're going to see how we can inject dependencies and we can inject code that we could use and we can share throughout our application. Now those are the things. There's a lot more stuff happening in ASP.NET Core, but those are the things I really wanted to highlight to you so we can kind of understand where some of the points that we have that we can inject some of this security stuff into, right? Let's take a look at a sample really quickly. All right, and I'm going to just run this. I gave up an offering to the demo god, so hopefully this works without any problems. Uh-oh, that's not good. All right, so I have a pretty simple sample, right? Now, I did the sample around the concept of a daycare, right? So some of you guys may or may not have children, but for all of you, your families are very important to you, your children are very important to you. And so the security of this application obviously is going to be very important. Now what this sample is I want to be able to sign in, and I want to be able to see what my child is doing throughout the day, right? So I'm going to have different users, right? So I'm going to sign in as John Smith, for instance. John Smith is a guardian, right? And so these are John's kids, right? So John has Billy and Bonnie. I can click on one of these things and I can see the timeline. This is what this guy's kids have been doing throughout the day. Right, I can click on assigned staff, I can see the teachers that are assigned to him, and I can also see the other guardians. Right? So this is John and this is Jane. This Jane happens to be, his wife or whatever. Right? Another thing I can do is I can sign in as a staff member. Right? So let's say I want to start in as staff instead. Rachel. Rachel lives at daycare.edu. Rachel's password, right? And now it's taking me to a part where Rachel could see these are the children that she's been assigned to as somebody that's working in this daycare. And then she can also see all the children within the application, right? Again, she can do something very similar. She can see exactly what his kids are doing throughout the day. She can come in and she can add notes, right? Very simple. I can come and add notes. Great day, yay. Right, and then the notes are added at the bottom, right? Very simple application. Now, let's look at some of the pieces that kind of help wire this stuff up. So first, let's look at how we're doing the basic cookie authentication, right? So let's look at the startup.cs. So now startup.cs is pretty much our entry point. This is where the application starts. This is where I set up how I want this application to run. Right? And there's two very important methods that are in here. There is the configure services, and then there's the configure. Right? Now, instead of configure services, this is where we wire up the dependency injection, where we wire up some of our services and some of the other pieces to build up the framework. Inside of the configure, this is where we're going to set up our middleware. So those pieces that we're talking about, this is where we're going to set up that pipeline. I want this code to run in this particular order. Right? So let's take a look inside of configure, right? Now, there's a lot of code in here. Some of this isn't important. But what's important here is I want you to see here I'm setting up cookie authentication, right? So I'm saying I want you to add cookie authentication to my application, right? I'm giving it a name. I'm saying this is going to be an HTTP only cookie. Does anybody know why I want it to be HTTP only? Because I don't want JavaScript to be somebody to be able to put JavaScript and be able to manipulate my cookie, right? So this is solely for transport back and forth. I don't want any client-side scripts to manipulate it. I'm giving it a login path, an access denied path, and then I have these two methods here: automatic authenticate and automatic challenge. So let's kind of talk about what some of these properties do, right? So the login path, as you can imagine, this is where I go to log into my application, right? The access denied path is a little bit different, and this is something that's new inside of the framework. Access denied path says, hey, I'm logged in, I'm authenticated, but you're not allowed to see this resource. You're not allowed to go into this section of the application, right? And this is new because before what would happen is when we got unauthorized, today, right, what it does is it hits you back to the login page, right? It's like, hey, you're not authorized to come here, go back and log in again, right? Well, here we have an option that we can do something a little bit differently, right? Now we can send them to, hey, well, you're not allowed to come in here, even though you're authenticated. And maybe we can give them some different options of some other things that they could do, right? Now, with automatic authenticate and automatic challenge, what this does is as the application starts and as my request is coming in, what it's going to do is going to say, OK, this user is not authenticated. Let me try and see if you have any claims or anything like that that I could create a user from. If not, then I'm going to challenge you, right? The challenge when the request is going back out, it's pretty much just saying, hey, well, I'm going to send you to the login page. Pretty much is what it's doing in this case, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, again, with this all being a pipeline, what you'll notice is I'm setting up this cookie middleware and these things before I call app.use MVC, right? The reason I do that is because I want my security middleware to run before my application does, right? What do you think would happen if I had this app.use MVC and I had the cookie middleware underneath it? There'd be probably no authentication, right? Like those cookies and those claims that are coming out of that user will not be inside of my application. So it's very important that the order that we put these in, right? For those of you guys who are wondering what this is at the bottom, app.use MVC with default route, it's pretty much the same thing as this, right? It's setting up that default route with the home as default and the index also as default. Now, let's actually go to our security controller and see what this looks like. So inside of my security controller, I have a login method. And again, as you can imagine, I have a login model. It pretty much just has the username and password property off of it, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to make sure that the model state is valid. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to click Sign in Guardian, right? And also notice too here, I can check the login type because I had that drop down, right? So if I want to see Sign in Guardian, let's open this. Now, pretty much what's happening here is that I'm going out to my database. That's what this daycare service is doing, right? It's saying, hey, do I have a guardian that matches these credentials? If I do, then I'm creating claims. I'm claiming a list of claims that I could assign to this user. So if you look on top, you notice I'm assigning a name identifier claim. It's pretty much like a unique ID, right? It could be, the IDs out of your databases or your GUIDs or whatever you use to uniquely identify a user in your system, right? There's the name, which again is the name of your user, the role, and in this case, I'm just happening to add an eval. Now, these claim types that are here, these are just strings. There's nothing special about them, right? So you could put in your own strings here and here if you wanted to. You can call them whatever you want. But again, what you're doing here is we're really just assigning key values to this user, right? Here, I'm moving forward. I'm going to add a claims identity, kind of like what we spoke about, right? And then off of the HTTP context, right? What we're doing here is I'm saying HTTP context sign in this user, right? And I'm passing in a claims principal, right? So again, I create my claims. I give them to a claims identity, and then I click sign in. Now, one of the things that you might notice that is important here is that I'm calling this thing application cookie middleware scheme. Now, this has to match the name of your cookie middleware that you gave it in your startup. So if I come back up here, right? So here I'm setting up the cookie middleware, authentication scheme, app middleware scheme. This has to be the same name as I'm signing in as. Because again, I can have different ways I can sign in users, right? I might be using OAuth or I might be using Facebook or something different. Here I'm saying I want you to sign in this user with cookies. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. And then if you notice, again, I'm doing a local redirect and then it sends me back to the page. Now, let's take a look at another way that we can sign in. So we just sign in with cookies, right? What if I wanted to sign in with some type of social, social thing, right? So here I just happen to be using GitHub. I don't imagine that you guys would create an application that you'd sign into your daycare with GitHub. Please don't make that a requirement for users, but just to show you something a little bit different. Now, what I'm going to do is, so most of you guys, I'm assuming, have a GitHub account. What you'll do is you'll go to this little tab here in your settings, right? And I have to come in and I have to register a new application, right? So again, I already registered one for the conference, right? And so these are pretty much my settings, right? I give my application a name, a homepage URL, and this is the URL that I'm expecting to call back, right? When I say authorize this application. Also, too, when you create this, you're going to notice you're going to get a client ID and a client secret. I don't mind you guys stealing this. I'm probably going to delete this before the app is done. So don't worry about hacking my application. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to click GitHub. And what you notice is now it sent me to the GitHub page, right? And I'm already signed in, so all I have to do is I just have to click authorize. And now it's signed me in, right? And it just happened to sign me in as a staff member, because that's the way that I have the application set up, right? And again, it shows me all the children that are inside of the daycare. Let's kind of see what that looks like to set up. So I have inside of here, I have a GitHub sign-in, right? And so pretty much all I'm doing is I'm calling challenge, right? And then I'm passing in the name of the GitHub middleware, right? So you saw before how I had to pass in the name of the cookie middleware. I want you to sign in with cookies this time, right? Also, if you did a challenge, I want you to challenge me with these cookies, right? And it'll send me to the login page. This time, if I challenge GitHub, it's going to send me to the GitHub login page, right? Because these are the credentials that I'm saying I want you to sign in with, right? So we're calling challenge. It sends me over to GitHub. Now let's look at what our callback looks like. Now I set it up so that after it's authenticated, after GitHub says, yes, he's good to go, we can let him into the app, I set it up so that it's going to call back to this method that's here, right? Now what it's doing, I'm going to tell you what this temp is in a second. But essentially what it's going to do is it's going to look at some of those credentials that come back from GitHub, right? And it's going to take those claims that I get back from them. Because again, now remember, we're using a third-party authentication system, right? But regardless of whether it's third-party or it's my own app, we're still talking about claims. We're still talking about these key values, right, that I'm going to get from a third party, right? So I'm getting some information from GitHub. Particularly, I'm getting the name out of the cookie that it sends back. And then I'm going to sign out of this temp cookie, and I'm going to sign into this other one, right? The main cookie. So this is my main application cookie, right? Why am I doing that, right? That should be the question you guys are asking. So let's come back over here. And if I'm jumping around too much, please guys let me know, because I know this is like a lot of information that's coming through right now. Now, I have a second set of cookie middleware that I set up in here. The reason I did that is because I want to be able to I want to check the credentials that are coming back from GitHub before I just automatically let the user into my app, right? So what happens is that after the GitHub middleware runs, it's going to take those credentials, it's going to put them in a temporary cookie for me, right? That temporary cookie is this cookie here that I set up. If you notice, it says on the authentication scheme, temp cookie middleware, right? So the GitHub cookies are going to, the GitHub claims are going to get put into this cookie. So now when I'm inside of my security controller, I'm expecting, once I've been successfully logged in with GitHub, I'm going to call HTTP context authentication authenticate the temp cookie. The temp cookie is there. Now I want to try and extract the claims that are inside of that temp cookie, right? Are you guys following me? Does that make sense? Right? So I'm going to extract the things out of the temp cookie, right? If it's null, then, well, I know that there's nothing in there, right? And then if something is in there, I'm going to go ahead and run through the app. So let me do this. Let me sign out. I'll put a breakpoint there, and I'll show you guys again what's happening. OK, so now I've authenticated with GitHub. I have this identity, right? This claims principal. And I'm going to, let's open these claims and see what kind of claims I have in here. Oop, let's move over. So you see here, I have things like my GitHub, come back. I have things like my GitHub URL. I have my GitHub name, for instance, right? If you notice these strings here, those are the claims that are coming back from that third-party authentication service, right? I've just put it in a cookie, and I'm going to extract the things that I need out of it, and now I'm going to sign it into my main application cookie. All right, so that's, what's that? All right. You can hit run. Right, and then again, I'm back inside of my application. Right. So that's pretty much login. That's how login works. Now, some other interesting stuff that's inside of here. Let's look at how we can do authorization. Now, I'm going to sign out. So I'm going to sign in as a different staff member. Dale at daycare.edu. Right. So again, Dale is another person inside of this app. What you'll notice is Dale does not have access to all of the children. Right? Particularly, Dale does not have access to Bonnie. Right? So if I click on Bonnie and I try and hit add note, it's going to say, sorry, you can't get in here. You're not allowed to add notes to this person. Right? But if you go back, if you try to add notes to another child, if you notice, OK, so you can add notes to this child, right? So let's see how we can wire this up. Right? Now, there's a new feature inside of, there's a new feature we have, and it's called Authorization Policies. Right? With Authorization Policies, what we can do is instead of hard coding roles and usernames and some of these type of things inside of our controllers and our actions, we could say, I want you to run this policy against this controller, or I want you to run it against this resource. And I want you to tell me, is this person allowed to come in here? The difference with authorization policies is that, again, instead of hard coding usernames inside of our methods or hard coding roles, it kind of gives us a little bit more flexibility in terms of verifying, is this person allowed to come into the app, or is it allowed to execute certain actions in here? So let's take a look at some of the requirements that we have so far. So whenever I create a policy, right? So here's what a policy looks like. Whenever I create a policy, right, I want to inherit from authorization handler, right? And so this is my handler that I'm going to use to check when the code is coming around. And then on top of that, I also have this thing called an authorization requirement. Okay? So we think about policies. Policies have multiple requirements, and then we can have multiple handlers for those requirements. Okay? So here, can add note requirement. If you notice that this is just a marker interface. There's no code really in here that you have to implement. This is just to let the system know that this is a requirement. Right? And here's the handler for my requirement. Right? And so the handler, what it does is it gets the context. And obviously, the context has the user on it. And now I could check and see if, for instance, in this case, this is checking to see if the user has a claim of admin on it. If you're an admin, then you're allowed to add notes. Right? Here's another policy that I have in here. This one is a little bit more involved. This policy that's here, this one is checking to see, are you a staff member? Right? And then if you are a staff member, is this child assigned to you? Right? So when we had, if you're an admin, we're just going to allow you to add notes to anybody. But if you're a staff member, can you add notes to this particular child? Right? So let's kind of walk through this one, since this one has a little bit more code, and see what's going on. Right? So again, I'm implementing this handle requirement async method that's required. Right? And then on the context, I'm checking to see if this person's a staff member or not. Okay, if you're a staff member, I'm going to try and see what your ID is. Because of that, I'm going to go down into the database. I'm going to pull you out, and then I'm going to see the children that you're assigned to. Right? If you're assigned to the child, then I'm going to call context.succeed. That means that, OK, you're allowed to add nodes to this child. Now, the context has there's three things that you could do. Right? I can call succeed, I could call fail, or I could do nothing. Right? Obviously, if I call succeed, that means that, OK, you've passed, you're successful, you could go ahead and you could execute the action. Right? If I call fail, that means that there is no way that I'm going to let you inside of my app to do anything, or at least not into this section. Right? If I do nothing, what it does is that it lets the requirement continue to run and evaluate some of the other ones that are in there. Because again, remember, a requirement can have more than one handler, right? So if I say that, OK, this is failed, regardless of whatever the other ones say, it's failed and you're not gonna get it, right? If this one says it's successful, but one of the other ones says that it's failed, then failure is kind of like the boss. Like failure wins, right? Once you call fail, it's not gonna run. But if you do nothing, what it'll do is it'll give the other ones a chance to evaluate and decide, well, whether this person is going to go in or not. Right? So for instance, if I send in as an admin, the admin is not going to pass this staff handler, because the admin doesn't have a role of staff. It has a role of admin. Right? But I'm not going to fail him. Right? I'm going to let it run. Right? So it runs through, and I don't call succeed or fail. And when it hits the staff admin one, and it does have this value of admin, then I call succeed. Then I know, OK, this person is going to be able to go through. Right? Do you guys understand the difference between calling fail and doing nothing? Yeah? OK. Now, let's see how we can set this up inside of, yes, sir?
Does the succeed trump? So if you hit succeed first, even if it might fail later, it still lets them in?
So this is what happens. All of them are going to always get evaluated. Failure is the only one that trumps everything.
Okay.
Right? If you call succeed and none of the other ones fail, then it's successful. Right? So it's kind of like an or relationship versus an and relationship. Right? So fail fails everything, but then as long as one succeeds and the other ones don't do anything, then it's considered to be successful. If none of them do anything, then it's considered to be a failure. Yeah, question?
What if you fall through all of your policies and don't call succeed or fail? Is that a failure?
That's a failure, yeah. That's a failure.
That's how it would be good.
Yeah, if it doesn't do anything, then you can consider that to be a failure. All right, so let's see how we can wire this up. So this is actually wired up inside of configure services. And again, when we talk about configure services, this is where a lot of the DI stuff gets wired up. Right? Now, right here, if you notice, I'm calling services that add authorization. Right? And inside of authorization, what you'll see is I'm adding some authorization policies. Okay? So my authorization policy, for instance, here, and here what's at the second line here is pretty much the same as at the top. Here I'm having one policy that says, hey, are you a guardian? Right? I have another policy that's pretty much just saying, hey, are you a staff member? I have one out here that says no uncle. I have an uncle in here, and we don't want uncle seeing what the kids are doing, so we kind of kick him out. Right? Right? But then what you notice is here, I'm adding the requirement. Right? So I have a policy builder, and I can add requirements to the policy builder. And I can add more than one requirement if I wanted to. Right? So again, let's think about it this way. I have a policy, right? And now I can attribute my actions or my methods with this policy. And now in my setup, I can have different types of requirements and different handlers for those requirements inside of my policy. So what does that mean? That means that I don't have to go back inside of my controller and change the role. Right? That means that I don't have to be going back and hard-coding usernames and things like that. What I can do is that I can change or I can update the requirements. And I can update it in one place, and it'll just propagate throughout wherever I need to execute this requirement. right? So again, for me, I like this much better than what we have today because for me, it's just a little bit more flexible. And it kind of separates your code a little bit. It makes it a little bit more testable. Right? So those are, excuse me. So this is where you create the policies. Now here, as I come down to the bottom, what you notice is I'm registering my handlers. Right? So this is the first handler that I think I showed you guys. Assign staff. Right? And then this one says staff admin. Right? So those are the two handlers that we see. So my handlers are inside of DI, and I'm also adding those policies inside of the DI container too. Now, if I go to, excuse me, if I go to my staff controller and start all the way at the top, here inside of my authorized attribute, I could put, hey, if you're going to come into this controller, you have to be a staff member, right? And I want you to check it based on the staff policy. Now, just in case you're wondering, this constant, this is just a string. That's all it is. It's just the name of the policy. That's all that it is. It's not an object or anything like that. It's just a constant string. And I would definitely recommend you guys use constants versus like hard coding, having these strings like all over the place. It makes it so much easier when you're coming in to change stuff. But anyway, on top of my controller, I'm saying, if you're a staff member, I want you to run the staff policy on this controller. So everything that's contained in this controller, you have to be a staff member to execute it. I also have a method, excuse me, called timeline. Right? And so then timeline is that little page that shows what people are doing. Now, the way that the staff and the guardian policies work are they just check to see, do you have this role? Right? Are you a guardian? Are you a staff member? Are you an admin? Can I allow you into this page? Right? Now here, when we're calling add note, we're doing something a little bit different. Right? We are leveraging this thing called the authorization service. Right? And the authorization service, it gets injected in. Right? And this is not something I wrote. This is something that came with the framework. We can inject it into our controller. Right? And now when we have an action, so here I'm doing my add note action. I'm calling authorization service authorize. I'm passing in the user, right? So this is the currently authenticated staff member. I'm passing in the child, right? Because again, I pass in a child ID, so I'm saying, can I do operations against this resource? This resource just happens to be a child at the time. Right? And then here, I'm passing in the requirement, right? So I'm passing in the resource, the person that wants to do something to the resource, and the requirement, right? Can this person add a note to this child, right? I'm passing in those three pieces of information, right? And now when I call authorize, it's going to go into the rest of the DI container. It's going to find the handlers for those, and it's going to run them, right? So this is kind of a way for us to manually invoke the handlers, right? When we use the authorize attribute at the top, it's kind of just running them for us automatically, right, based on the requirement. But here, we're manually running these handlers. So now, based on that, excuse me, if this fails, you notice we're going to call challenge. And like we said before, what challenge is going to do is going to send me to that denied page, right? Because we know that I'm logged in when I'm here. But now you're not allowed to work on this resource, so I'm going to send you to the denied page. You might want to do something different. Maybe you might want to, give the user a different message, or send them to another section of the application. And then when we come down here at the bottom, excuse me, and here at the bottom, here I'm just adding the note. So again, we create these handlers, right? We create the requirements for the handlers, and then now we can check for our code, like what is it that these people can do. Okay. Any questions about that? Yes.
Can you go back to your controller?
My controller.
Let's say that you have a page where you have very granular requirements for all sorts of UX. What would you recommend for manually invoking this? Would you do it for every single item that you're trying to hide or lock down?
Okay, so it depends. So let's say you have a controller, and let's say I'm rendering some list of things, right? Now, maybe what you could do is, for instance, here I'm just looking at a resource. I'm I'm taking in a single, where'd it go? I'm taking in a single resource of child, right? Maybe instead of taking in a single resource, you might want to take in a list of children, right? So based on that, when I render to the page, you kind of filter out the list and you say, okay, well, these are the ones that you have access to, right? Maybe you could do something like that, right? Does that make sense? Does that kind of answer your question a little bit? Yeah? Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think the spirit of the, I don't want to talk to this question. I think the spirit of the question is, what if I have a child and it has name, date of birth, and social security number?
Okay, sure.
If I'm the parent, I can see it, but if I'm a staff member, I cannot. So like row level security for data fields.
Oh, okay.
Data fields for visibility.
Oh, okay.
Can you single that?
Sure. So you could do something like that in here also. I mean, probably what I would do, excuse me, I'd probably want to create, for instance, like, yeah, you could do something like that in here. You just probably put the logic inside of your handler here. And you say, okay, well, if you're of this role or if you're this person, then these are the fields that I'm going to allow you to see, right? And then you could just as easily, like, you know, change the values of them, or you can hide them. You can put ... if you don't want them to see them, or you could do something like that. Right. You had a question?
Yeah. Are you able to utilize the authorized decorator to restrict by requirements, or is it just by a policy, or that sort of thing?
So you restrict by policy, right? You do it by policy. So if I show you, if I go back here to the top, so here I'm saying for this controller, I want you to run this policy, right? This just happens to be a staff policy, right? And so now this is going to run the handlers for that particular policy, right? Anybody else? Any more questions? Yeah? Okay. So let me show you some other little cool things that we could do with security. Now, when I was setting up my GitHub account, right, let's scroll down to the bottom. So Jeff kind of mentioned this a little bit if you're inside of Jeff's talk. He talked a little bit about secrets. He kind of mentioned it a little bit. So one of the things we can do with ASP .NET Core is we have a really granular configuration system, right? So here, what you notice I'm doing is, as I'm setting up my GitHub account, or my GitHub authentication, I'm going into the configuration and I'm saying, can you give me my secret and my key, right? I want you to go into the configuration system and pull that out. And then let me go to the top and I'll show you where my configuration kind of lives. So here I have a configuration builder, right? I'm setting the base path and I'm saying, I want you to get configuration values out of the app settings. I want you to get it outside of the environment variables. And I also want you to get this thing called add user secrets, right? Now what add user secrets are, it's more of like a development time, tool. So what you'll do is, let's say me and you are building an app, for instance, and you have your security keys, I have my security keys, but I don't want to check them into source control, and I don't want to share them to you, right? But I want to have my own, like when I'm on my own personal setup, like I want to use my keys, right? What add user secrets does is that it allows you to keep those pretty much local, right? Like it'll store them in your user profile, and so now when it's in dev time, preferably dev time, don't use this in production or anything like that, please. When it's on dev time, you could go into your, into your store, and you can pull out these values, right? Now, there's a couple of ways that you can get into that. Now, if you right-click on your project, you should have this thing here called Manage User Secrets, right? If I hit up Manage User Secrets, you're going to see those are my keys, right? And I put them inside of this file. Now, again, this file is stored in your profile. When I say your profile, I'm talking about your Windows profile. So again, this file never gets checked into source control. It's not a part of your project. It's not even in the folder, right? So that means too that if you download this or clone it to some other machine, you're not going to have those values in here, right? Like these are completely local to this machine.
Question?
Yes, sir.
What if you actually need to have two different GitHub client IDs and secrets for multiple projects?
Sure. So what you could do is, so if you notice what I did here, for instance, like I kind of namespace this. You know what I mean? Like you can create your own namespacing too if you wanted to. So this could be, GitHub app, GitHub app 1, right? And then you can create app 2, app 3, app 4, and so on and so forth.
But then, so everyone has used the same namespace at that point?
Everybody will have to use the same key. When I say the same key, you'll have to use the same identifier to pull the information out.
Right, so like if Jason and I are in the situation you were talking about, he would have that namespace, his keys GitHub 1 and
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Now, one thing we know too, that we know that ASP .NET Core, it also runs. Let me come up. Oh, let's not do that. We know that it runs. This is just kind of like a Visual Studio helper thing. If we wanted to be able to access this on the command line, right, we could use the .NET command, right? So you could do .NET-user secrets, right? And now this gives us the user manager tool on the command line. So I guess if you're not on Windows and you're not using Visual Studio and you're on OS X or some other operating system doing dev, you could use this, right? You could do user secrets.list, right? And if you notice here, it's showing me the different secrets that I have here. Just in the same way too, I could do something like, for instance, .NET user secrets, and I could say set this equal to that, right? I could do something like that if I wanted to. And now what you notice is that my configuration just got updated, right? But again, this is all local. This is not something that gets shared around a lot.
So if you're hosting in Azure, is the recommendation still to use like the Azure app settings to manage your keys?
Yeah. So what happens? What this middleware here actually does, or not the middleware, this add environment variables, it's actually smart enough to know whether you're running in Azure or not. So if you set those variables inside of Azure, for instance, add environment variables will kind of be like, okay, you're hosting in Azure. Let me see if I could pull these values out for you. So that would actually just automatically populate once you're using add environment variables.
Quick clarification. When you say it stores the secrets,
Who's talking? Okay, there you go. I'm sorry, I didn't see.
it doesn't store them with the actual profile of whoever's running this machine. Does it store it into the .NET itself framework?
No. So you have a app data /local/profile under your /user account on the machine. It's inside of one of those folders.
Oh, okay.
So it's not in like a .NET folder or anything like that. It's in your personal users folder. So if somebody else signs out, or you sign out and somebody else signs into the same machine, but they're signed in as a different user, they're not going to see your information. They're not going to see your keys and your secrets, right? This is very much scoped just for that individual person. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other questions? No? Okay. Excuse me. So let's kind of go back to the slides. I haven't looked at these slides a little bit. Okay, so we talked about that. Okay, so there's a lot more stuff that we could talk about, right? And again, there's definitely not a lot of time during the day. But so some things that you guys should definitely pay attention to as you're going forward. So ASP.NET Identity 3. So a lot of the stuff that I've done just now, signing in users and doing logouts, and actually a lot more stuff that I've actually shown, stuff like doing locking out the users, creating data stores for claims and stuff like that. That'll actually do it for you. But that in and of itself that's a whole nother talk that you need to spend a little bit of time with. If you guys want to do anything with social or anything like that, OpenID Connect. If you're working with web APIs, bearer tokens, or something else that you guys definitely want to pay attention to, and also think about setting up your own STS, like Secure Token Service. If you ever heard about things like Identity Server, or what's that other thing called? This one called ASOS, actually. Let me see if I could find it and show it to you. That one is actually a pretty good open source thing. Oh, and if you're wondering where I got the GitHub middleware from, it came from this website, or these providers, ASP.NET, security.OAuth providers, and they have a whole bunch of providers in here. Beam, Buffer, Dropbox, Fitbit, Gitter, LinkedIn, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of stuff in here that you could kind of come in and, just so that you don't want to write yourself. Because, hey, nobody wants to write this stuff themselves, right? Yahoo, if anybody uses Yahoo. There's a lot of stuff in here that we can kind of come in and we can play around with. Right? But again, what I really hope that you guys got from this was, the security in ASP.NET Core is a lot more flexible than what it used to be, right? We, through the power of doing requirements and doing handlers, it's a lot easier to log in and log out. It's a lot easier to control who has access to different parts of your app, and that type of thing. Now, here's some resources for you guys to take a look at and check out. Definitely check out the docs. This is that site I just showed you, ASP.NET.contrib. If you guys follow me on Twitter, I just actually tweeted out the link to the samples. And then I can actually show you you can get them right now too. It's already on here. And if you look for, if you come to this site, you can actually see the samples that I showed you guys today. So you guys can take a look through them and see what you think. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Is there secrets? Are they going to be JSON, or are we going to move that into XML like everything else in Core?
That's a great question. I have no idea.
No idea?
I have absolutely no idea if they're going to change that or not. Anybody else? No? Good? All right, great. Thank you guys very much. Have a good day.